Easter talking about the end, and on Easter Sunday we even used a maze to kind of talk about the end. And sometimes when you're doing a maze, there's a little trick. If you start with the end, you begin with the end, it can help you kind of get through the middle and trace your way back. And so it helps for us to know the end. We've been looking at the end in 1 Peter through this season of Easter. Although in a maze like this one, personally, I sit down with this maze and I just get frustrated and I walk away. I give up. I don't even want to tackle it. And there are times in life where you feel the same way. You're in the middle of the maze and you're like, I'm done. I don't even want to start. I don't know where to begin. We live in a fleeing society where when things get difficult, we tend to flee, just to quit, walk away, retreat, escape. So if somebody calls you that you don't like and you don't want them to call you anymore, you can flee. You just push a button and you block their number. If you have a rough day at school or work or life is really stressful, you can flee. You just escape and you binge Netflix or Disney Plus or Hulu or Paramount Plus, and you just kind of waste the day away. You escape. If you don't like your job, just quit. Don't show up. Unemployment's low, so you can just go find another one. We live in a fleeing society where it's very easy for us, and we tend to do this. If something is difficult, we flee, we quit, we walk away, or escape, or retreat. We're not the first ones. This is not unusual in the history of humanity. Peter and the disciples were fleeing people as well. Jesus said, "Follow me." It was a really simple command, about the easiest thing he said, "Follow me." And still, when things got difficult, they fled. When he was arrested in the garden, the disciples fled. When Peter denied Jesus 3 times and then realized he was a failure and wept, he fled. When Jesus was hanging on the cross, brutal violence, blood, execution, most of his followers fled. After Jesus was buried in the tomb, after he died, his disciples fled. They escaped into an upper room. They locked the door. They fled. Which is why it's really interesting to me that the same Peter who fled is the same Peter who wrote the letter that we call 1 Peter. And if you're looking at 1 Peter, you're like, this is a different guy than we know in the Gospels. In the Gospels, we see a guy who's trying, but he keeps failing. But then in 1 Peter, we're listening to the same guy who's saying, hey, there's persecution, there's struggle, but we have living hope in Jesus. Persevere, keep going. He's saying different things. He's living differently in 1 Peter. So today, near the end of the letter, we're concluding our time in 1 Peter. We're concluding the season of Easter. I want you to hear an important word from Peter. An important word not to flee, but to stay. I think this is a really important word for you today. Peter is saying near the end of his letter, not to flee, but to stay. We start in chapter 4, verse 7. It was our first verse of this little text. If you'd read this with me. The end of all things is at hand. Therefore, be self-controlled and sober-minded for the sake of your prayers. So he starts out, this is near the end of the letter. He says, the end of all things is at hand. The end of all things. So we believe that this doesn't just go on forever, that there is an end. There is an end. There's an end to the 9-to-5 busyness and traffic. There's an end to saving for retirement and watching the stock market. There's an end to carting kids to 1,000,000 practices, and there's an end to finals and graduations, and there's an end to doctor's appointments. There's a day when that just doesn't matter anymore because there will be an end. And even more, Peter goes on, the end of all things is at hand. Like you can reach out and it's almost touchable. Peter doesn't want you to be ignorant or to be clueless. The end is closer than we think. And sometimes we think, oh, we got a whole life ahead of us. This just goes on. There's always tomorrow. And there is, and God gives us day by day. But in the grand scheme of things, if you kind of zoom out, the end is closer than we think. It's at hand, Peter says. And if you believe this, if you see this reality, you live differently. And so he goes on with a really important word, therefore. The end of all things is at hand, therefore. Therefore is a pivot word. And Peter uses it, Paul uses it a lot. It's a pivot word. So it takes what's before it and then pivots and says, now, given this reality, do this. Now, given this fact, live this way or have this mind. So, given the fact that the end of all things is at hand, everybody would agree with that, even those who don't believe in Jesus. There is an end, and maybe it's closer than we think. Given that fact, therefore, now do this. Now see this. So what comes after therefore? Does Peter say, the end of all things is at hand, so flee, or give up, or retreat, or you only live once, so just do whatever you want, live for pleasure? No, that's not what Peter says. The end of all things is at hand, therefore. And then he has a list of things, of ways in which you stay in hope through hopeful action. Hope isn't just like a